My name is Leanne. Thank you so much for having me out today, guys. I really actually love frogs a lot, so I always take every opportunity I have in order to share my love of frogs because I just like them so much. And this is perfect timing because you can already hear them starting to call. So hopefully you guys can get an earful and an eyeful of some of the frogs we have here in Ontario. And then on your wanderings this week and this month, kind of get an eyeful and just see if you can tell them apart. Now, what I find often happens is we tend to group reptiles and amphibians together, and that's most likely because they share the same habitat, but they're not the same thing. And one of the big differences is that reptiles, they have scales and they have claws, and amphibians do not. So if you just kind of want to get a visual in your head of Ontario's only lizard, the five-line skink, it has scales, and those scales actually allow it to hold moisture better than, say, a salamander who has a very similar body type. Okay, a salamander always has to stay moist because they don't have the scales and they don't have claws, but a lizard will. And another kind of example too is where we often find turtles and frogs living in the same waters. They're not the same things. Turtles are reptiles, and just one quick difference is they have to come out of the water to lay their eggs. But frogs actually have to go back into the water to lay their eggs. And the reason for that is because frog eggs don't have shells. And so without that and no water, what happens is the eggs will dry out and the embryos will die. So that's kind of some of the big differences there. Alrighty. Now, frogs and toads, they did evolve from fish-like ancestors probably about 370 million years ago. In fact, the word amphibian comes from the Greek words amphibi, meaning both, and bios, meaning life, or of two lives. And that's because frogs and toads, they have both an aquatic and a terrestrial stage. And they're never independent of water. I don't think anything is ever independent of water, but they're truly not. I always have this kind of thing, we go through the life cycle of frogs and toads when I give this talk. And I know this might seem silly to some because we do this with kids when they're very, very young, even from kindergarten on. But if you're like me, kindergarten was a long time ago. So I just like to go over it anyway. Okay, so here in the life cycles, and you can see the eggs are laid. And like I said, if you just follow my pointer at the top here, the eggs are laid in a mucus casing. There isn't a shell, but the egg itself is black. And that's not an accident. If you can think about wearing a black shirt in the summertime, what happens is it attracts heat. And that's really important for some of our frogs because it creates a quicker transformation. Like I said, this is very important, especially with some of those early spring arrivals, like the spring peeper that you hear calling right now, because those guys really want to get moving and become full-size frogs. Spring peepers are laying their eggs in vernal pools. And vernal pools generally dry up before the summer's done or freeze before the winter. So those types of frogs, they really want to go through this transformation and kind of get hopping out on their own. Okay. Now, if you look up here again, just following my pointer, frogs do have these external gills. But as their lungs start to form, the skin will grow over those gills, and then they'll start to mouth with their algae teeth or their rasping teeth. Right now, your frogs and toads are a herbaceous creature, okay? But then they continue to grow, and what they do is they start to grow their back legs first, and then the front legs are already growing inside those gill chambers, and they emerge later. It's kind of a funny thing. Just going back to salamanders, I hear they're their opposite. I hear that their front legs emerge and then their backs, and I can only assume that's because the frog's back legs are just so important to their defense. They need to be nice and strong, and they need to get them growing and getting them ready. And then down at the bottom here, we have this last stages, which is a very rapid change, going from that tadpole into the pollywog into the full-size frog. And it's actually, you can think of it almost like an awkward adolescent stage because the frog actually can't eat during that time. But what it does, it lives off that reabsorbed tissue from its shrinking tail. So they don't just drop their tail, they reabsorb that energy. And during that time can actually lose up to 25% of their body weight from the tadpole weight to the full-time frog until they get to where they want to go. Okay. This is actually a complete transformation. These animals start from herbaceous and now they're carnivores. Okay, so they're not eating algae very much anymore. I always like to go through as well, what's the difference between toads and frogs? Because they are different, again, similar but not the same. And a lot of people don't actually know this. With toads, you actually have that thicker, wartier skin. And because of that, toads can live a little further from water than your frogs can. Frogs, they sort of look a little more slimy and smooth, and they have that moister skin than your toad does. Your frog also has a more narrow body. They look a little more athletic, where your toads are a little more bulbousy and pudgy looking around the middle, okay? Also, when you're out there in the next couple of weeks, something to notice is the eyes. Your toads have these lower football-shaped eyes, where frogs have higher, rounder, bulgier eyes. And another thing to look for is the legs. Toads are going to have a shorter, less powerful legs, so they tend to run a little more than they hop, where your frogs have those nice, long hind legs, and they'll take true jumps, okay? One of the big things too between these two guys is that toads actually have fewer predators. And that's because of the peritoid gland. And I'll show you in a picture what I mean by that gland in just a few minutes. Okay, that gland actually gives off secretions. It gives off a bitter taste and smell that can burn an animal's eyes or nostrils. It doesn't really hurt them, but it's enough to make the animal drop the toad. That's why sometimes if you're out for a walk and you find what looks like a perfectly good toad, but it's dead, but there's not much wrong with it, something might have picked it up, dog, bird, whatever, and dropped it because of that taste, and the shock has killed them. But that peritoid gland and its secretions are actually there in both the tadpole and the toad stage. So they'll have much fewer predators than your frogs do because they don't have that. Okay, and a big one, which again, a really great time of year for this talk, when you're out there in your nature walks this week, just look at the way the eggs are laid. Toad eggs are laid in long strings. I usually feel like there's two side by side, two nice long strings, where your frog eggs are usually spread in a large cluster, a big, large mucus cluster. So just kind of the things to look for there. Toads. I know this is a talk on frogs of Ontario, and we do have 11 beautiful different types of frogs here in Ontario, but we only have 2 types of toads. So I always pepper these guys in, because I figure if you ask me to come back next year and talk about toads, I don't have an hour in me. So we just get it done here and now. Like I said, in Ontario, we only have 2 different types of toads. The one you're finding probably 98% of the time is an American toad, this guy right here. And actually, I'll just, with my pointer right now, point out that spot. That's that peritoid gland that gives off that secretion right there. Frogs don't have that, okay? Now, this American toad, if you look at his range, you'll find he's in most of Ontario, okay? And his breeding occurs from late March to early June. It depends how far north they are. And the breeding usually occurs in warm, shallow pools, streams, even large puddles or roadside ditches. That's where these guys are laying their eggs. And their eggs will hatch in just a few weeks, days or even weeks. It depends on that heat transfer. And then the tadpole stage will last 50 to 60 days. And these guys are dropping about 20,000 eggs at a time. These guys, quite often you find them in woods and all kinds of places. They can actually extend their tongue to catch prey, but they mostly feed on terrestrial insects and worms. And this guy, if you don't know, all our frogs and toads here in Ontario, they have their own types of calls. So you can actually learn the difference in their calls and go out into the woods and say, I know who's here. I can hear them. This is actually what your American toad sounds like. It's about a 20 to 30 minute long trill. I'll let you just listen. I think you're probably going to start hearing that soon if you haven't already. Okay. Our other toad here in Ontario that we have is your Fowler's toad, and he is an endangered species. We don't see a lot of him. If you look at the range map down here, quite a bit different. Okay, this guy only is found on the north shores of Lake Erie. So we have him in Rondeau, Long Point, Niagara. And part of the reason for that is because this toad prefers sandy shorelines and peninsula habitats. They're really well adapted to those early stages of ecological succession. So in sand dunes and lakeshore habitats. This guy usually breeds in May, but usually they're breeding when the temperature is above 14 degrees. They don't like it too chilly. And they breed in backwater marshes and other shallow areas of permanent water bodies. And you'll find their numbers will fluctuate a lot over time. And it's probably because of the unstable nature of their habitats. And with the flooding and the storms, it just kind of wreaks a little havoc. They're also sensitive to pesticides, and habitat loss is a problem for these guys as well. And the difference too, is where your American toad drops 20,000 eggs, this guy drops 12,000 eggs. So they're not dropping quite as many eggs. Okay, I'm not going to fool you any. These guys are really, really hard to tell apart. They're not easy to tell apart, but there are ways to do it. Number one is location. Where did you find them? Were you in the woods or were you on the beach? If you're in the woods, it's most likely an American toad. You're on the beach, eureka, you might be having a good day. But another thing to look for is their bumps. Your American toad actually only has 1 to 2 bumps per blotches, and your Fowler's toad will have 3 to 4 bumps per blotches. So again, really kind of hard to tell. It's a matter of picking them up and looking, but there are little differences. Something a little easier to tell is their tummies. Your American toad will have spots all over their tummy, but a Fowler's toad will have an all-white tummy. They sometimes have one central dot in the middle, but that will be about it. They're generally an all-white tummy. And then another one is a peritoid gland, that one that I was talking about that gives off the secretion. Over here on our left-hand side is your American toad. And you can see that peritoid gland, there's a little space between it and the eye crest. On your Fowler's toad, not so much. The peritoid gland is really sitting on that eye crest almost. Okay, and then the last thing, one of your best ways to tell is actually their call. If you can remember that American toad call you just heard, that 20 to 30 second loud trill, it's a whole lot different than your Fowler's toad. It's actually pretty creepy when you're out walking around on your own. It kind of sounds like a baby a little bit, but very, very much different. So there are 2 toads here in Ontario. Here's the moment. We'll get to our frogs. So as I said, 11 different types of frogs here in Ontario. The cricket frog is extirpated. We don't really have him here anymore, but if he's found, he's protected. So that's a positive. Our frogs are cut into 2 different groups, from your true frogs to your tree frogs. And really under your true frog, you have wood frogs, leopard frogs, green frogs, bullfrogs, mink frogs, and pickerel frogs. And under your tree frogs, you have gray tree frogs, spring peepers, western chorus frogs, boreal chorus frogs, and that cricket frog. Some of the main differences, or we wouldn't put them in different categories, the main difference you're going to find is true frogs hibernate in the mud at the bottom of ponds. Now, don't get me wrong. Nature is always going to do what nature does. So there's going to be one who fools you, but generally the difference is true frogs hibernate in mud, and your tree frogs, they hibernate under forest floor objects like rocks and logs and leaves and stuff like that. Another thing too is your tree frogs, they have, whether they're small or large discs on the tips of their toes, all your tree frogs are going to have that. Even if you're a tree frog that seldom climbs trees, if you have those discs, you're a tree frog. Some of these photos coming up, almost all of these photos are mine. I'll try to be honest if they're not, but there's 1 or 2 photos that highlight that, and I'll show you if I can, okay? So our very first frog here that I want to talk about today in terms of true frogs is your wood frog. And we might as well just get it off the hop. This is the one who's going to fool you. He is a true frog, but he actually does hibernate not in the bottom of ponds. This guy does hibernate under the leaf litter. He can actually freeze solid. Has something to do with the sugars in their body, kind of it works as an antifreeze, but they can withstand freezing over the winter. It's kind of neat. This is your most widespread frog here in Ontario. In fact, all of Canada, really, but he's found in all of Ontario, and he's our most terrestrial Ontario frog. They'll often have a kind of a coppery tinge like you see in this picture. But one of the things you really want to look for in terms of definitive, like distinct features, how do I know I found a wood frog? The wood frog is our little bandit of the woods, okay? The wood frog is wearing this little black mask, if you can see my cursor going right by the eye there. Okay, and that's how you know you have a wood frog, that and this sort of white upper lip, okay? But really it's that mask. They all wear that mask. And you'll note here, just again, follow my cursor, that ridge along the back, that's called a dorsolateral ridge or fold. Some frogs will have them, some don't, but your wood frog definitely does. This guy uses vernal pools, so he is an early spring arrival. He's already out. I've already heard him calling. And he does prefer the forest floor habitat, and you'll find him in damp woodlands and swamps. Rather a small frog, a very small frog, and he burrows into that soil for the winter. And he'll eat beetles, spiders, mosquitoes, flies, things like that. Okay, now you probably want to hear his call too. Let me just find it here for you. One second. There it is. Almost kind of like two wet balloons rubbing together is always what I think that one sounds like a bit. Our next true frog here is our leopard frog, and he's probably one of our most familiar frogs, most widespread, very widespread, I find he is. And you'll find them in shorelines, meadows, forest floors, old fields. They actually travel pretty considerable distances over land, especially on kind of rainy days, a little bit like we had today. And in fact, it's that overland travel. He's a bit of an adventurer. This is a guy you usually, when you find one squished on the road, it's usually a leopard frog, and that's probably because they are a little more adventurous. Something to look for with this guy is this white lip. Okay, that extends kind of from the eye, under the ear, and over the shoulder. Okay, that's a big hint right there. But you're also, where the leopard frog gets his name is, of course, his spots. He looks like a leopard, right? Other frogs you'll find have spots. One of the things to look for when you're asking yourself, do I have a leopard frog? Is leopard frogs, their spots are often ringed in a little bit of gold. Okay, and you'll see that right there. Another distinct feature to look for is these leg bandings. Okay, and you can kind of see right where my cursor is. Other frogs will have leg bandings, but they're not usually so defined and so almost like a stamp that's gone straight across. Okay, and that's really, really good. And I point that out because I live here, I live near Long Point, and we're on a sand plain. So sometimes what happens when you're in a sandy site is you can find leopard frogs that have few or no spots on their back. And I've certainly found them, not that it's common, but they certainly are like that down here sometimes. So those leg bandings can help you decide what it is you have as well. This guy, he's our best jumper as far as frogs go in Ontario, and he drops about 2,000 eggs on twigs in shallow water. I'll just give you a chance to hear him as well. There we go. Wait, that's a spring peeper. One second. Alrighty, that's your leopard frog. Now, our next one is your green frog, and I like to do this guy next after the leopard frog. Your green frog is often, he's considered your most typical frog. He's what people think of when they think of as a frog, but he can be your most confusing frog, and that's because he can be green or brown or bronze or blue. He sometimes has spots. He sometimes doesn't. Okay, so he can be your most tricky frog, or one of them. So with this photo that I've chosen here, you can see he does have spots like the leopard frog, but they're not necessarily rimmed in gold. He also has markings on his legs, but they're not near that banded, and you don't notice it quite as much. You're going to find these guys, they're found in or near permanent water. You seldom find them very far from water, but something cool about these guys is the tadpoles can take more than 1 year to develop. So they can actually overwinter as a tadpole before they start hopping out. And because of that, they do need to find permanent bodies of water. Vernal pools won't work for these guys, or they just won't make it. Something else that's really, really, yeah, you'll find these guys, rivers, streams, ponds, marshes, anything kind of deep enough. Something really good too, if you're into nature photography, and I know a lot of us probably are, these guys make excellent photographic subjects. And that's because they have a tendency to sit motionless and wait until the very last minute to jump. And then they'll dive into the water and they'll escape from their predators like that. So really kind of neat. And something to look for, like I said, these guys can be a lot different than the rest. Okay, it's this white to yellow chin that you want to look for with that bright green yellowish upper mouth. That's one of the things to kind of help you out with as well. Something else to note too is, again, the green frog has that dorsal lateral ridge or fold, quite a bit different than the leopard frog had. Okay, but our next guy doesn't have it, and that's why I want you to notice that. Let me just pull up the green frog for a minute. This guy's kind of sounds a little bit like a banjo plucking. Alrighty, so that was your green frog. Now our next one is a bullfrog. Okay, and I pointed out, like I said, that green frog, sometimes he has spots, sometimes he doesn't, but he always has that ridge. If you notice here with your bullfrog does not have a dorsal lateral ridge or fold. It just doesn't exist. What you have here is just this piece that goes around the tympanum, the eardrum, but it doesn't go down the back. Okay, this is our largest frog we have in Ontario. They can grow up towards to 17 centimeters. Even the tadpoles are bigger than the other tadpoles. In fact, the tadpoles, they can take up to 3 years before they transform from a tadpole to a frog. And the bullfrog isn't even typically sexually mature until it's about 5 years old. Okay, where you're gonna find these is large permanent bodies of water, because again, that tadpole, he's gonna overwinter sometimes twice before he turns into a frog. And you'll usually find them in well-vegetated shorelines. There are times that you'll find after breeding season that you'll find these frogs sometimes in smaller ponds, and it really works good for them. These guys, they'll eat anything they can fit into their mouth, including other frogs, baby birds. They don't have teeth where they can bite into it, but they are able to force their eyes down and hold their prey in place. And so that usually helps them out quite a bit. Yeah, very similar to the greener, the mink frog, but like I said, no dorsal lateral ridge. And he gets his name, the bullfrog, because people feel like he has a very deep call that sounds like juggerum, juggerum, juggerum. Okay, and I'll let you hear that. I have to find it. There we go. Okay, so that's kind of what your bullfrog sounds like. These guys drop about 20,000 eggs at a time, and they do breed a little later than some of your other frogs, just May to July. I don't know, big guys just seem to be able to do that. Kind of a cool thing we try to tell kids or adults when we're taking them out in the wetlands. This here, that tympanum or the eardrum, if that's actually larger than the eye, what you have is a male bullfrog. If it's the same size as the eye, you have a female bullfrog. Kind of a fun little fact there. Okay. And this, I put this photo in because I do wetland programs with kids where I take them out in the wetlands and I tell them why it's important, and then we see what we can see is in the water. So this is a 14-year-old student I had 2 years ago, but understand this 14-year-old student was over 6 feet tall. So that's a full-size man's hand, really, and that's the size of the frog. They get very, very big. And something interesting, a bullfrog, sometimes when you catch them and pick them up, they scream at you. And they can be very, very vocal. They're like, Mah! Okay, kind of neat. Our last two frogs that are true frogs that I want to talk about is your mink frog up here in the upper box, okay, and then your pickerel frog here in the bottom. These aren't my photos. I don't want to say they are. And part of that is the mink frog, the one up in the upper corner here. He is not found in the Carolinian zone. So we don't have him here in Southern Ontario. This is not where he exists. But if you look at his coloring, these aren't spots. He has like a heavy molting and dark blotches. Even on his legs, it's not banding like some of the other guys. They're blotches, okay? This guy, the mink frog, he gets his name because he releases a musk when he's disturbed, and that's where they get his name from. This guy can also take more than one season to change. And I'll let you hear what he sounds like as well. Ooh, do that one again. Alrighty, and in your bottom corner there, that's your pickerel frog. And he looks very similar to a leopard frog. He's not near as widespread as a leopard frog, though. He doesn't have quite the territory. And there's something else about this guy that'll help you say, I don't have a leopard frog, or I do, is this guy, he's never green on the top. That dorsal bit is never green. It's usually brown, sometimes golden, sometimes cream. And then he does have this very prominent bronze fold here, but he's never green, where your leopard frog is. Also, when you kind of look at those spots, they're not as circular. They're a little more squarish and a little more symmetry going on in the way that it resides on the back. When I was first learning frogs, the lady who was teaching me told me to think of the pickerel frog like pickle jars. And that's why it was different than leopard frogs. I don't know if that helps you, but I always remember that piece of advice. Here's its sound. Oh, 1 second. Okay, almost like a snoring sound. So he sounds quite a bit different than the other guys. You're going to find this guy, your pickerel frog, most commonly in wetlands or found near streams and rivers. Okay, and he actually can have a skin secretion that may deter predators and may be toxic to other frogs. So kind of a neat frog there. So that's it. That's your true frogs. After that, what we have is your tree frogs. So a little bit different again. Like I said, they sleep in the leaf litter generally. Okay, and the one you're already hearing right now, most of you, if you're out and about, is your spring peeper. This guy really is your harbinger of spring, just like your wood frog. They arrive with any kind of warm water, and they use vernal pools. Even when there's ice still on them, they'll start dropping eggs. The eggs will take 2 to 3 weeks to hatch, and the tadpoles transform in about 3 months. But what you're really looking for when you're looking at a spring peeper and you're asking yourself, do I have a spring peeper? You're looking for this X on the back. If you can see that right there. All spring peepers have an X on their back, which is really, really cool. After breeding, you're going to find them in leaf litters in wooded areas. They can climb trees, but you seldom find them more than 1 meter off the ground. They're not that much of a tree climber. Yeah, hibernates in the leaf litter, so he can also withstand freezing. But ounce for ounce, okay, this guy at full size, that's a full size spring peeper there. That's my husband's hand. Okay, he fits on a loonie at full size, but gram for gram, it's probably one of your loudest creatures on the planet. Their call can carry up to 2 kilometers. So even this time of year, if you're driving with the windows down and you drive past a woodlot, you can often hear them this time of year. They're active at night, they're hunting insects, and you usually find them hidden under logs, rocks, and leaves during the day. They actually have a large range, but I'll let you hear them. Okay, so very, very loud. And you can see where they get their name from, the spring peeper. They're out there singing early, and we're always happy to hear them. Your next one is the gray tree frog. And if you don't know, this is the only Ontario frog that's able to change its color. Again, things in nature, they want to do their own thing. Gray tree frogs have this warty look to them, unlike other frogs, but it is actually a frog. So he does look a little more toadish, but it is a frog. If you look down here at this bottom picture, that's what I'm talking about, those toe pads. Really, really obvious on this guy. Okay. And yeah, he can turn from gray to from gray to green. It doesn't take them very long to do it. One of the things you'll want to do for identifying features and asking yourself, is this what I have? There's a white mark under the eye, which I'm going to show you in the next photo, but it's actually one of the big things is they have bright orange yellow under thighs. And you think, why would I notice that? But this frog isn't a super shy frog. This frog, if you live in the country, you sometimes find them hanging out on your windows and you look outside, and the way they're hanging on your windows, you get a good view of those under thighs and you can see they're like a yellowy orange color. This guy can be found in many types of trees, generally near permanent water, but they'll usually live in woodlands, but they could frequent orchards. You can find this guy at the top of the tallest trees. He really is, he deserves the name tree frog, and he's quite the climber. You'll find him hidden in tree holes, under bark, rotten logs, under leaves, and their eggs are usually laid in shallow woodland ponds, marshes, bogs, swamps, puddles, anything that doesn't generally have a really significant current, okay? And they breed in late spring to early summer. Their tadpoles will take about 40 to 60 days before they hatch. This photo here, I just took this photo last fall. This is actually on milkweed, and just an idea how well frogs can camouflage. That's that little bit of white here that I was talking about on the eye. You couldn't see it as well as the other photos, but from far away, oh, sorry about that. I actually thought what I was looking at was bird poop. And then I recognized, well, why would poop be there in milkweed in that spot? And so I went to investigate, and that's how I found them. But they hide really, really well. I'll let you hear this guy's call. It sounds a lot like the red-bellied woodpecker, I think. Kind of more of a chuckling little sound there. Yeah, they're really, really good camouflage, but they do depend on trees. So habitat loss is going to be an issue for these guys, for all frogs, I think, for all animals. The last two to talk about is our chorus frogs, and there's two different types of chorus frogs. Your Western chorus frog and your Boreal chorus frog. They are very small frogs. And if you look where the other guys, they had spots or blotches or molting, these guys have long stripes, okay? Really similar in appearance. These are small frogs, barely the length of a loony. And it's one of your, again, your first frogs to call in the spring, mid-March. You tend to find these guys in woodlands, meadows, most often in treeless areas. Nice, you find them in woodlands or wetlands all the time, but they are very shy. So you often don't see them after breeding season. More, I just hear their calls than anything else. The two different frogs, they do have very similar appearance, but if you note, the Western chorus frog has longer legs, okay, than the Boreal chorus frog. And because of that, the Boreal chorus frog, he takes shorter hops, not necessarily leaps. And the Western chorus frog will have a slightly slower trill, but again, kind of hard to hear. Up until 1989, these guys were actually considered the same, but because of the physical differences, they went looking. And if you note the two range maps, okay, on the left side is the Western and on the right is the Boreal, so it goes with the pictures you're just looking at. You can see the space where the range doesn't meet, okay? So they are two different subspecies there. These guys are active at night in the fields and in open woods within 100 meters of water, and they can withstand freezing as well. So they'll hibernate above the frost line, and their eggs usually last in about 2 weeks. Okay, their larval stage is pretty short. I'll let you hear what these guys sound like, kind of like fingers going over a comb. Just find it for you here. Chorus frog, sorry. Okay, and then the last one that I already mentioned was the cricket frog. It was only found in Peely Island, and it's thought to be exported from there, that we don't have it, but there is protection should it be found. But they are considered widespread and pretty abundant in the US, and it's a very, very small frog. I'll let you hear its call. Sounds like two stones clicking together, really, I think. We just, okay. There it is. Oh, sorry. That's it. Okay. Now just, and we can go over this in the next couple slides here, or just some photos, and just see if you can test your knowledge on what you see here. I'll just give you like 10 seconds on each and see if you can just figure out what kind of frog you think you have here. And here's another one. All righty. So that's my presentation, but we can go over those. I'm not sure how to get back to you guys.
Can I just share your screen again? Or
I can share my screen again. Yes. New share.
Yeah. I think you already are, but just choose the PowerPoint again.
Okay. See my screen? 1 second. I think I closed it accidentally.
Okay.
Share, but let me open it. It's right here.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. So good, because I can hear people now. Good. I wasn't sure. So what do you guys think? Does anybody know what they had on this first photo?
Yeah, you can add your answers into the Q&A box and we'll have a look.
Okay. Does anybody think they know? Oh, here we go. Let me see.
Everybody's got leopard frog. That's good.
Yes, it's a leopard frog. Good. Yes. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So, and if you look, right, it'll have those big bandings on the legs. He has that gold around him. Okay. What about this second one? Is it going? There we go. Bring up my Q&A again. What do you guys think? Oh, you can probably see that too. Let me look. What do we got? Mink. It's not a mink. Tree. Pickerel, mink. This one is actually, this was the one, guys, I told you was the most tricky. And that's why I put it in there. This is actually your green frog. So you see he has spots, but they're not golden. He has this green and yellow lip, which is what kind of makes it easiest too. He's sitting still for me. Okay. And then he does have bandings on their legs, but they're not near as thick as that leopard frog. But like I said, this guy can be very, very tricky. Let's see. What about this one? Did anybody know this guy? Mm-hmm. It is a gray tree frog. Absolutely. It's a gray tree frog. You can see the little pads on his hands a bit. There's that spot where the white is. Okay, a little bit wartier. What about this guy? Does anyone know? Bullfrog. No. So Glenn, you're right. It's a green frog. So again, I said he's very, very tricky, but because this one here, he doesn't have spots. He's a little greener, but he does have that dorsal lateral ridge. So he's not going to be a bullfrog. Okay. And then our very last one. We'll just put it down here. Does anyone know what this one was? Okay. See the answers coming in. You guys are close. It's a toad. The hint is his white tummy. This one's your Fowler's toad. Again, though, really, really hard to tell them apart, but that one's your Fowler's toad. And that's because of that more whiter tummy, even though he's in green stuff. This one isn't my photo either. I hate to say it is, but yeah, that's him. Now, I seen a question up earlier. It was just quite a ways up. Somebody asked me, how long do they live? I'm not quite sure which one you're asking about, but I know that I mentioned American frogs. Sorry, bullfrogs, not American frogs. Bullfrogs, they don't start breeding till they're about 5. They live to be about 8 years old. That's the only frog I would know off the top of my head. But I have heard of a bullfrog living in captivity for 16 years. So kind of like longer than your house cat when nothing's after it, really. Did that answer your questions? Do you know of a frog sorry, so somebody asked, do I know of a frog app with sounds on it that I'd recommend? What I have, where I learned a lot of this from, was the Marsh Monitoring Program, and I think it's put out by the Toronto Zoo. So it was a CD that you could buy, and it had all their calls on it and how to tell them apart. Anybody else have any questions? Okay. Well,
Excuse
I'm
me,
gonna
Leanne.
stop.
There's one person who has a photo. If you could ID it, would you be able to do that, or would you mind?
Yes. Can I?
Okay.
Is it in the question and answers?
The picture is, and I'm gonna. It's Colleen. I'm gonna make her a co-host, and she can share her screen and show people that way.
Okay.
Okay. The
I'll
easiest
stop
thing to do,
sharing.
right? Okay. Okay, Colleen. So I'm gonna make you co-host, and you can share your screen, and we can see that image.
So sorry, I'm on the machine that doesn't have the photograph on it.
All right.
Yeah. But
Okay.
thank
Well,
you.
yeah. If you you can either put it in the nature notes or send it to Bill Lamond would know, or myself. I might be able to figure out where I can find out.
Okay,
who would know
will do.
from
Thank you.
that. Okay.
But yeah, it happens all the time, Colleen. People send me photos of frogs and snakes all the time, and turtles. It happens often. So let me just frogs. I don't, I'm sorry, just looking through some of the questions. I don't know what people who study frogs are called. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a name for it, but I don't know. Fix themselves, things are very well developing. And for how long do they stay attached? So sorry, I'm just going to read this question. Why do tadpoles fix themselves to the substrates while developing? And how long do they stay attached? I'm unaware. It's just a matter of them getting enough nutrients to get big enough to start going along. It might even be in terms of sticking to the like sticking to things. There are the rasping teeth, so they are eating. But it might just give them a little more protection so that big currents aren't pushing them along as things like that as well. When you say bullfrogs made up 5 years, does that include the tadpole years? My impression, it's for Debbie and Dennis, my impression is it's 3 years and then 2 more. So the 3 years as a tadpole plus 2 more has always been my idea on that. What was the reason for the decline of the cricket frog? I'm unsure. I've never looked into it. It was really their northern range. It might just have been too cold. I'm not sure. Bird Studies Canada will provide resources too for surveying amphibians. Probably Bird Studies Canada is awesome. They do a lot of cool things. Another question, do you have any tips for the best way to find frogs for someone starting out? I have 2 young kids and they're not all excited at being quiet and still, no, yeah, they're not. Actually, I did, when my guys are little, they're 10 and 12 now, but I did a lot of time in wetlands with my guys. Some of the best ways to find them is just keep looking along the edges. And then if you step a little bit closer, you'll find them start jumping and jumping away, and then you'll start to see them. The more you're out, the keener, quicker, faster your eyes get. In terms of a bullfrog, it'll usually give an alarm call. It'll when it jumps away from you. But that's really your best bet, is just keeping a keen eye and looking. I always tell people with wildlife, don't look for wildlife, look for motion. And just let your eyes go soft until you notice the motion. And then it seems to work a lot better for me. Which frog and toad species are endangered and what can we do to help protect them? There's quite a few. Like I said, the Fowler's toad is. I'd have to look up each individual frog. I'm unaware just to know off the top of my head. And part of it's because they're not overly studied. Herpetologist, thank you. What you can do to help protect them is to help protect your wetlands and let your local representatives know that wetlands are important to you and that you want to see them protected. And just making sure your voice is heard in that. And as well as just watching things, even your own choices in your house. What pesticides are you using? What cleaning agents and where are they going? Are you using, and then things like that is some of your best bet that you can do. So another one here. I am in grade 2, 7 years old, and I really like the information. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm glad to see somebody 7 years old here and enjoying this. My guys very much enjoy nature too. So somebody has a question here, Shirley, and my grandson would love to see this. Will the presentation with audio be available? This might be a question for you, Chris or Lou. I think you were recording it. I think you can maybe answer that one question a little better than me.
Yeah, we do record them all, and they'll all be posted on the club's website. I can't say exactly when. We're having a little technical issues with that at the moment, but I can give it hopefully within the next couple of weeks. You'll be able to go to the site and see them all. All the presentations are listed there. You can see any one of them are there. Yeah.
And so Caitlin here is asking too, is there one thing neighborhoods and communities do to protect their habitat? Again, for me, I really feel like, for me, it's sharing the spark and coming out to things like this and letting other people know that these are our neighbors, the same as every other neighbor we have. And so they deserve the same protection as the people across the street from you. But again, it's just making sure that you stand up for that, and then you let our representatives know that this is important to us. And I think that's the number one thing you can do, as well as just some more supporting some of your, in this area, we have a lot of things, and I'm sure Hamilton does as well, where we do have a land trust, and there's lots of nature conservancy land and things like that. So just getting out to help those groups as much as you can when you can. Somebody asked, are pickerel frogs found in Hamilton? I actually can't remember their range right now, but I feel like I hear them. But I've yet to actually ever see a pickerel frog here. The only time I've ever seen one was on the Ontario-Quebec border when I was there a few years ago. But yeah, so if they're actually here, I just have to look up the range map, but on Nature Ontario has a beautiful website, and you might be able to find one there. Hopefully that's a good place to lead you. We have a small backyard pond. How can we attract neighborhood toads to our pond? Again, your toads, a lot of times they're a little thicker and wartier, so they're not as interested in water as some of your frogs will. The thing about any animal, if you want to find it, figure out what it eats and put what it eats there. I'm not gonna lie, if I want a photo of a Canadian lynx, well, I know it eats snowshoe hare, so I'm gonna figure out what the snowshoe hare eats and goes there. So that's what I would suggest, is figuring out what kind of frogs you want, and then just making sure that your backyard pond supports that habitat with those naturally occurring plants. And sorry, somebody else, can you repeat about your quiz pictures, the characteristics of the green frog? Thank you. Yes, I can. Green frogs are very, very tricky, because sometimes they have spots and sometimes they don't. And so, but really what you want to look for was that dorsal lateral ridge across the back. So we'll have that fold on his back where your bullfrog will not. And if he has spots, they're probably not ringed in gold like your leopard frog. And if he has bandings on his legs, they won't be as thick. But the thing about your green frog is he often doesn't have those. Sometimes he has the bands, sometimes he has the spots, sometimes he doesn't. They're very, very tricky frog, but just start with that dorsal lateral ridge on his back and go from there is what I suggest. In mid-June, the forest floor in Coots Paradise can be covered with tiny, tiny froggy things. Are these toadlets? If so, perhaps a little information on the toad life cycle will be helpful. Yeah, Peter, the toad life cycle is really pretty much the same as the frogs in a big way. Good chance it is toadlets. Like toadlets come out of little ponds, really, and you'll just see them, tons of them will start coming out, and they're very, very little. But even just look for that peritoid gland. If it has a peritoid gland, then it's a toadlet and not a froglet. But yeah, you'll see them quite a bit, and even in the woods and stuff as well. Did I miss anyone's question?
Yeah, Leanne, there was one back a little ways. It says, we've heard more frogs this year than the last couple of years. Is that a benefit of COVID and fewer people driving?
It could be. Certainly there's lots of frogs, and so I mean they're dropping such large numbers because they know they get eaten, and they know they're going to get run over. It very well could be. It could be because people are out more often and noticing. It's funny, I can walk with people all the time, and they don't, if they're not a naturalist or have naturalistic tendencies, they just don't see the same things or hear them. But I find all my woodlots here and all my parks here are more full of people than ever before. It's a chance they just didn't notice their neighbors too, maybe. But it could be. Certainly frogs are very, very susceptible to pollution too. It's really problematic for them. That's why they're such a good indicator species that things aren't well. So in terms of COVID, and presumably we're not driving as much and less greenhouse gases, it could very well be. I'm not sure. Was there any more questions people noticed I missed? Scroll up. Yeah, I think I got them all.